everyone, and welcome to Nurau Talks. Today I have with me Nicole Abi-Esber. Nicole, we're so glad to have you on the live today. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks.
So Nicole, big news is that just 2 weeks ago, she officially graduated from her PhD at Harvard Business School. That's very exciting. And now she is going to accept a professor position at the London School of Economics. So it's a little intro to our guest today, but really Nicole does a lot of really cool work on psychological safety, which is something we've talked about quite a bit on the lives here. And her research looks at how leaders can create climates of psychological safety and inclusion. So she does a lot of laboratory experiments. We'll talk more in detail about what exactly she measures and how she looks at conversational dynamics using something cool called natural language processing. And we're going to get also really practical about what managers can do. So let's maybe dive right in. Nicole, your research looks a lot at team dynamics and psychological safety. So for those of us who maybe are not so familiar with that, I was wondering if you could first maybe catch us up on what psychological safety is. So how would you define it? And then what would you say are some behaviors that are indicative of high psychological safety in a team?
Yeah, for sure. So I study psychological safety. I think it's super important. It's basically the idea that you feel comfortable being yourself and saying exactly what's on your mind in a team. So not just agreeing, not just saying what you think your boss wants to hear, but if you have an idea or even a criticism, something that may go against the grain, do you feel comfortable sharing it? If you have something to say, but you think it may be a little, maybe people may be offended or you don't know how people will react, if you're worried they're going to judge you, then that wouldn't be a psychologically safe team. So a psychological safe team is characterized by you being able to speak your mind. And unfortunately, they are not very common in workplaces. And so I'm really interested in how we can create more of that.
Yeah, and I know there's been a lot of really great work done by Amy Edmondson, who talked about how psychological safety has huge impacts on performance and a lot of metrics that people are concerned about if you're HR and listening in. So psychological safety really is a kind of a hot topic in the management world.
Yeah, for sure. So psychological safety leads to teams that are more innovative and creative. It also allows teams to capitalize on diversity. So it's not enough just to hire people who are more diverse if they don't feel safe to bring in their different perspectives. But when you can really make people feel safe, you unlock those benefits of having all these different perspectives on the team. Google recently did a study on what makes a great team. And there's a great write-up of it in the New York Times, but they found that psychological safety was the number one best predictor above and beyond experience levels, composition, number of members. Psychological safety was really the strongest predictor of team performance.
Wow, that's fascinating. So let's dive a bit deeper into what exactly helps people feel like they can speak up, because I know your research looks into a lot of different factors. And so could you tell our audience a bit about what those factors are and what your research has found in terms of what affects, whether or not we choose to speak up in a group setting?
Yeah, of course. So one thing that does not affect who chooses to speak up is intelligence or competence. So there's a lot of research showing that the smartest people are not necessarily the ones who are the loudest. So that leaves us with workplace scenarios. A lot of decisions and important things happen during meetings, but you're not always hearing from the people who have the best ideas. You may be, but not necessarily. And so it's really important to think very carefully and thoughtfully and intentionally about who's speaking and who's not speaking, because you have these existing ideas that are already there. It's existing human capital, but how do we unlock it? And so the research says there are two things that lead people to feel safe to speak up. And the first is feeling safe. So creating a climate of psychological safety. But a second really important thing is feeling like if you speak up, it will be effective. It's not going to be futile. So you could feel really safe, have a super nice manager, But if every time you say something, they're like, great idea, but never do anything with it, you'll stop bringing up ideas. So those are really the two keys to speaking up. First, creating a climate of safety. And second, creating a climate where employees feel like their voices are heard and acted upon. It's not just, just listening for the sake of listening. And then in terms of how to create psychological safety, that's a little bit of an open area for research. And that's where my research really looks at.
Cool. So now that you've given us a little hook, I think all of us are like, now what's your research?
Yeah.
For the nerds among us, would you tell us a bit about what your PhD research was, and tell us a bit about what natural language processing was and how that factored into your PhD?
Yeah, of course. So basically, there is work showing that certain types of leaders lead to more psychological safety. So I want to nod to that. There is a lot of work about leaders who are more open, who are more inclusive, more transformational. But it's kind of hard if someone's like, be more transformational. What does that actually mean? So my work looks at more specifics, like actual verbal and nonverbal behaviors. And that's where natural language processing comes in. If you think of a meeting and you have a transcript of what everyone is saying, I would look into what words is the leader saying that makes employees feel more psychologically safe. So I'm really diving into the specifics. What I find is that basically verbal and nonverbal signals of attention and respect really lead to people feeling more safe. So nodding, smiling, making eye contact, not being on your phone. If somebody says something, rephrasing it or calling back to it. So saying something like, Vivienne, this reminds me of something you said last week. That's a very clear signal that I'm paying attention to you and I respect your contributions. And that makes people feel more psychologically safe. Anything you can do, like follow-up questions, just like engaging thoughtfully with the person and making them feel respected can go a long way to creating psychological safety on teams.
And so what you would actually record conversations that teams had. And then how would you measure psychological safety? Would you give them a scale after to then compare which factors led to higher psychological safety?
Yeah, so exactly that. Psychological safety is very subjective. You can't necessarily tell. Someone may be smiling and agreeing, but holding back, an idea they have or criticism they may have. So I record conversations and then I give people scales after to measure subjective psychological safety. But then I also look at objective things like how often do they speak, how long do they speak for, and whether they say something that's a little more challenging, not just agreeing with the flow of the conversation.
Right. Cool. And was there anything that surprised you from what you found? Were your findings kind of like, oh, okay, I know that, or was it like, oh, and that's kind of counterintuitive to me?
Yeah, I think one thing that surprised me is how far nonverbal behaviors can go. So I think I maybe started the PhD thinking a lot about verbal behaviors, ways to include people, calling on them to speak. And what's been really surprising is how powerful nonverbals are. So I have a paper about eye gaze, and I show that just making more eye contact with people can make them feel safer, more included, and that can literally impact how often they speak and how many seconds they speak for.
Wow.
And I found that really cool.
That's so cool. Which leads me to my next question. So we had Dr. Kevin Kellaway on the live last week, and he's a big guy in terms of mental health training for managers. So as you can imagine, his focus is very practical, very actionable. Like, what can we tell managers today?
Yeah.
And so his question for you was, if you could give a manager top 3 things, like they want to have the most impact on their team to make it psychologically safe, what kind of advice would you give?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll try to narrow it down. So I think the first one would be calling back to what I said earlier, demonstrating that you're paying attention and that you respect your employees, both verbally and non-verbally. So rephrasing what they say, calling back to something they said earlier, nodding, smiling, being actively engaged would be the first one. The second one is being vulnerable. So there's some research that shows that leaders who say things like, listen, I hired you because you're smarter than me, or you have more experience with this than me, saying things that make the hierarchy feel a little bit more flat, revealing a time that you failed, that can be really effective in getting people to feel safe to speak their mind. And then the third one, going back to what we said earlier about voice being really important in terms of not feeling futile. So making people feel like when they say something, you're actually acting on it. So even if that action doesn't mean you're going to implement the idea, but just, calling back to the idea, paying attention to the idea, not just listening and then never thinking about it again. So basically making them feel like when they speak, it's actually having an effect. Right. I would say those three things.
Yeah. Very nice. I love how you boiled that down. Yeah, it's hard to boil a PhD down,
It's been 5 years, so.
Oh, I know, yeah. So, that gets me thinking about how well you think managers are equipped to do that, like to provide a psychologically safe team. Do you feel like is there training? Do managers ever receive training, you think, on how to build psychological safety? Is it mostly like ad hoc, I'm just going to read an HBR article here and there kind of thing? Or what have you found, I guess, in interacting with managers? What is your level of knowledge around psychological safety?
I think that people understand that it's important. I think it's becoming a phrase that people intuitively understand and that they've heard before. I do think that as people are more and more stressed and overworked, it does fall to the wayside. It's not necessarily a top priority. If you are running up against a deadline or you feel overworked and burnt out, it's hard to then be really active and engaged with your team. Let's say if someone's speaking, maybe you're trying to answer emails or maybe you're thinking about what you have to do next. So I think it is top of mind, but maybe is not a top priority. And I think that is a mistake. I think that focusing on psychological safety has really important impacts, like you mentioned with Amy Edmondson's work, really important impacts in terms of innovation, creativity, capitalizing on diversity. So if you're losing out on it, it's your loss. So I think it should be a priority.
Right. And it's interesting that a lot of managers, maybe they think, oh, I just have to run this meeting efficiently, productivity. And it's not often that you think a nonverbal behavior, as you said, could have such an impact, even just giving your attention or your eye gaze to someone, and that really counterintuitively is what can help your team be more productive and more creative versus being like, okay, we have these deadlines, that's me. Yeah.
People are really intuitive. So if a manager is coming into a meeting with, we have to get this done, I want to be out of here, let's be efficient, people aren't going to feel safe to bring up a creative idea or something out of the box. But that's often where innovation really happens.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm curious to know, as a researcher, I bet you have lots of other questions in your mind. Where do you think your research on psychological safety will take you? What are the next steps? As a professor in LSE, where does your headspace kind of go to?
Yeah, I'm really interested. So I said at the beginning that who speaks up is not related to who's the smartest person. And I'm really interested in understanding, really in depth, what does lead people to feel safe to speak up? Is it personality things like introversion or being more extroverted? I'm really interested right now in people who speak English as a second language. Yeah. So I'm originally Lebanese, and so my family, a lot of them speak English as a second language. And there's research that shows that non-native speakers speak up less. But I'm finding in my own research that they may actually give better comments when they do speak because they may have a higher bar. So they're not saying everything that comes to their mind, but if they have something interesting, that barrier may be a little higher. So yeah, I'm interested in who speaks and whose comments are maybe the most effective.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Like how language and culture, I think we don't know much about that. And like diversity in teams, I think there's a lot of good work that can be done around culture and diversity and how that impacts team. So yeah, I'm so curious to kind of follow up on your work. That's awesome. So before we end our live, we always ask our speakers what they want to ask the next guest, and it just so happens that, well, the next guest. It's Dr. Maya Rosnag-Milon. She does research on what makes people click with each other and how we can deepen those interpersonal connections. And she actually also uses natural language processing in her research. So yeah, I'm sure you've asked her many questions before, but what question would you like me to pose to her in our next live?
So Maya has work on what makes people click and how people develop a shared reality. So for Maya is what happens when, like, how does that click unclick? Like, let's say you're having a really great connection with someone, it's going well, you're establishing reality, then you realize that they are of an opposing political party, or there's like something that you learn about them that makes you immediately want to end the click. How does that happen, or how does the other person sense that? I'm interested in not only what makes people click, but what happens when that click is over. Maya is amazing, so your viewers are in for a treat.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. And I'll definitely let her know that it was Nicole that asked her about that unclick. It should be great. Well, thank you everyone for being here on our live, and we look forward to seeing you with Dr. Maya. And if you're interested about that click unclick, what that process is like, definitely stay tuned for our next live. And meanwhile, thank you so much, Nicole, for being here with us. It was such a joy to hear you talk about a really important topic, managers and psychological safety and team dynamics. And yeah, all the best on your professorship in LSE. I'm sure it'll be really great.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk about this.
Thanks, Nicole.